Good day. This is another of my updates, or if you like, my summaries of the overall situation in terms of the Ukraine conflict. But before I proceed, just to remind you again that if you're watching any of our videos, that's to say the Duran videos or Alexander Mercouris videos or Alex Christoforou videos on Rumble, you can go to the red maroon button at the top of the video. Press on that button. That will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you can join our active locals community, become an active member, publish your own content, and participate in my live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. So the last few hours have seen lots of developments in the Ukraine conflict. First of all, I have to again touch on the military situation, which is becoming, it seems to me, the fog of war is beginning slightly to lift, and we're beginning to get a clearer picture of what the situation is like in the main focus of the battle, which is in eastern Ukraine. Now, I want to stress again, as I do in every program when I discuss military affairs, that I take all my information from open sources. I'm not privy to any confidential facts. I don't have any sources directly on the ground, at least not in the area of the main battle in eastern Ukraine. And of course, I'm not a military person with any kind of military background. So strategy, military strategy and tactics and operation are not my major point. Anyway, it seems to me that we can now say with some confidence that the situation in eastern Ukraine is rapidly evolving towards a climax. Firstly, it's clear that a large Ukrainian military force, some put it as high as 14,500 men, is now fully encircled and under siege in the town of Mariupol, which is a town on the Sea of Azov. It's completely cut off from relief from the rest of the Ukrainian military. And it seems that this force of 14,500 men allegedly has been bottled up in the central areas of the city. It's been driven from the outskirts, and there's some reports, which of course again I cannot verify, that it's running short of supplies and that his position is becoming increasingly desperate as the Russian forces, the forces of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the forces that have joined the Russians from Chechnya are gradually, in fact, rapidly closing in. Now, it's not possible for me to say how long it will be before this battle in Mariupol ends, but it's beginning to look increasingly likely that it will end fairly soon, within perhaps the next couple of days, perhaps as much of a week, but short of a ceasefire, it seems to me that its end is now certain. The second development is further north, significantly further north, in fact, where there is a second encirclement of Ukrainian troops in the Lugansk region. This is not the same as the territory of the Lugansk People's Republics prior to this outbreak of hostilities at the end of February. It is the larger Lugansk region, most of which, in fact, was under Ukrainian control. Anyway, there was a significant force of Ukrainian troops there, mostly concentrated around a town called Severodonetsk, and it seems this particular force is now rapidly has now essentially been encircled also. I don't know the numbers of the troops involved. I gather I've seen figures of somewhere between 12,000 and significantly more also mentioned, but it seems that this force also is in grave difficulties. And then there is a third force which is located more centrally between the force in Severodonetsk and the southern area where Mariupol is now encircled. There is a further force opposite the city of Donetsk, which is still entrenched there. It's still not fully cut off from the rest of Ukraine, but whose position is becoming increasingly precarious as well. Now, I've seen various numbers given for the Ukrainian forces in total that are gradually either fully encircled, as the forces in Mariupol and in several of Donetsk apparently are, together, or in the process of being encircled, like the force in Donetsk is. But one figure I've seen, which perhaps is as reliable as any in this situation, is 76,000 men. That is apparently the better part of the Ukrainian army. And the fact that this force in eastern Ukraine is now in increasing crisis may explain certain things that are happening in Kiev. Notably, President Zelensky of Ukraine has carried out a major reshuffle of his generals. The general in overall command of the forces in eastern Ukraine has now been recalled to Kiev, where he's apparently been instructed to take charge of the defense of Kiev itself, and an entirely new officer is being sent to take command of the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine. Now, you can explain this reshuffle in all sorts of ways. I'm not going to say that I obviously don't know the inside stories, the actual reasons, but it does seem to me that it would be surprising to reshuffle the general in overall command of a force in eastern Ukraine shortly after, 2 weeks into a battle, especially if that battle was going well. One would have thought that if things were going well in eastern Ukraine, that general would be left in charge to get on with his job. So unless there's something here which I don't understand, it seems to me that this reshuffle that has been carefully executed in order to give the impression that nobody is being criticized or blamed for any problem. But the fact that this reshuffle has occurred points, to my mind, to a situation that does suggest that the situation in eastern Ukraine for the Ukrainians is now becoming extremely difficult. There have also been reports, which again, obviously, I cannot confirm, that artillery and aircraft attacks, bombing by aircraft, by the Russian Air Force and the Russian artillery in eastern Ukraine is now intensifying as these various Ukrainian troops are coming under increasing pressure. So, as I said, it does seem to me as if the fog of war in eastern Ukraine is slightly lifting, and we're beginning to get a clearer picture of the state of the battle there. Now, another reason to think that things are not going well for the Ukrainians is a speech, or rather a statement, that Zelensky made today, over the course of today, in which he finally and fully and comprehensively admitted that Ukraine is never going to join NATO. Now, he's come very close to saying that in the last few days, but this is the first time that I know when he has actually said that Ukraine joining NATO is never going to happen. And the Daily Telegraph, at least, is construing that as a sign that Zelensky is looking to make a deal with the Russians. He's looking for peace. Well, we will see. Negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians continue to be underway, taking place in a virtual format. We will see where they end and how they go, and whether Zelensky is prepared to meet all of the Russian conditions, at least on Ukraine's NATO membership. The Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, appears to have said that it isn't just enough for Ukraine to say that it's not going to join NATO. This needs to be locked in with changes not just to Ukraine's constitutional structure, but within treaty arrangements and other things to make sure that this is never changed, never reversed. So we will see what happens with respect to the negotiations that are underway. Now, alongside the negotiations and alongside the military developments, we're getting what you might call the information war, the public relations, all of which, it should be said very clearly, is part of war. And one shouldn't be, I think, overly critical of this, even if one is concerned about some of the things that have been done in relation to it. Anyway, it seems that the prime ministers of 3 East European countries, Poland, Slovakia and Slovenia, are heading to Kiev by train to meet Zelensky there, together with some other top officials. Apparently this was organised by the president of the EU Council, Charles Michel, and it's intended to show Zelensky's solidarity. I do wonder whether there might be more under discussion, perhaps Ukraine's bid for EU membership, something which, by the way, I don't think is going to go anywhere fast, or possibly something else. Maybe the hope is that these officials these prime ministers and officials from East European states are going to Kiev in order to persuade Zelensky to leave Kiev, as apparently the US has at various times tried to get him to do. I think that Zelensky himself will be very reluctant to leave Kiev. I think he will probably calculate that if he does leave Kiev, he could make way, he might create political space for someone else to take control there. And there's also a real possibility that the situation in Kiev, that the resistance in Kiev could entirely collapse in Zelensky's absence. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but it does seem to me that up to now, Zelensky has resisted efforts to get him to leave Kiev, and I think for very good reasons. And I think if he does leave, I think many Ukrainians will feel that the end game is indeed approaching. So we'll see whether he does leave Kiev, perhaps with his delegation, or perhaps more substantive discussions will take place, or maybe this is just, as it perhaps appears to be, just a public relations exercise. Anyway, we will see what comes of it. Of course, all of this comes before Zelensky is due to make his second address to the United States Congress by virtual address to the US Congress, which is tomorrow. Now, all of this is public relations, but of course there's also diplomacy. And on Monday, there was the much expected meeting between the President Biden's National Security Advisor, Yang-Sullivan, and President Xi Jinping of China's National Security Advisor, Jiechi, which took place in Rome. Now, the United States, in the run-up to this meeting, which apparently has been scheduled for some time and was originally intended to be a follow-up to the virtual summit meeting that President Biden and President Xi had some weeks ago. In the run-up to this meeting on Monday, the United States is trying to focus it heavily on Ukraine, and it's tried to spread stories about Chinese military support to Russia, perhaps in order to embarrass the Chinese, to say things that could distance them from Russia, and which might get the Chinese to change their position. And the United States has attempted to do that by trying to focus this entire summit meeting on Ukraine. And what Yang-Sullivan discovered when he met with Yang Jiechi is that the Chinese, obviously understanding what was going on, refused to play ball. So it's fascinating to compare the readouts of this meeting provided by the Americans and by the Chinese. The American readout, which is very brief, 80 words long, focuses principally on Ukraine. Chinese readout, which is much longer, deals primarily with bilateral relations and has a very extensive section on Taiwan, and it refers to Ukraine only in passing. This is what the Chinese readout has to say about Ukraine, and it's the very last sentence of a very long readout. The two sides also exchanged views on international and regional issues, including the Ukraine issue, the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula, the Iranian nuclear issue, and the Afghan issue. So, as far as China is concerned, Ukraine is just one issue amongst several. It takes equal place with the nuclear crisis in Korea, the Iran crisis, the Afghan issue. The Chinese refuse to be drawn into a prolonged discussion about it and stuck firmly to their position. Unless there be any doubt about this, there is now the usual accompanying article on this very topic in Global Times, and the title reads, US fails to trap China over Ukraine at Yang-Sullivan meeting. And it goes on to say, ahead of the meeting, the US has been constantly spreading disinformation about China's role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and some US officials trying to mix the Ukraine crisis with the Taiwan question, trying to hijack China over the issues and portraying a false image of the China-Russia alliance. The words China-Russia alliance being in quotation marks. All these ill-intentioned tactics, in the eyes of Chinese experts, reflect little goodwill from the US for constructive talks, whilst its contradiction between its words and deeds dampens the prospects of a healthy and stable China-US relationship. Hours after the meeting between Yang and Sullivan finished, China released an 850-word readout reiterating its stance on core issues such as the Taiwan question and the current situation in Ukraine. In rejecting Washington's continuous pressure on misleading Beijing over the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Yang called for taking a long-term view, actively advocating a vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security, encouraging relevant parties to conduct equal-footed dialogue and set up a balanced, effective and sustainable European security framework based on the principle of indivisible security in a bid to preserve peace in Europe and around the world. The Chinese side resolutely opposes any words and deeds that spread false information or discredit or distort and discredit China's position. On the heels of the high-level meeting, some US media outlets, citing unnamed officials, hyped the role of China in the crisis by saying that Russia asked China to give it military equipment and support for the war, and based on that disinformation, Sullivan expressed deep concerns about China's close ties with Russia during the meeting. In addition, some other Western media outlets also hyped China's willingness to provide military assistance to Russia, and before the meeting with Yang, Sullivan warned the so-called consequences if China helps Russia evade Western sanctions. And then it goes on to say, although the Ukraine issue was a priority for the US during Monday's meeting to pressure China to take a stand, it seems the attempt was unsuccessful. Wu Xinbo, Dean of the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University, told Global Times on Tuesday. Not only did China's position remain unchanged, but it also refuted the rumors and false information the US was spreading. It means that the goal of the US for this meeting has failed. So, whatever the US was trying to do at this meeting, either embarrass the Chinese into somehow distancing themselves from the Russian position, or pressuring the Chinese in some other way, or perhaps trapping the Chinese into statements that the US could construe as an excuse to impose sanctions on China, the Chinese sidestep them all. Given what exceptionally experienced and skillful diplomats they are, no one should be surprised about this. I would add that in addition to the 80-word readout, which is entirely uninformative, the White House has also published a briefing with the usual anonymous officials about the meeting with Jiechi, which, however, also says extraordinarily little. For the record, I don't believe this story about China offering military aid to Russia or of Russia seeking China's military aid in relation to Ukraine. I think all this is misinformation or disinformation intended to put China in a difficult position at the talks on Monday in Rome, and as the Chinese say, to lead China into a trap, but that attempt failed. All this incident has done is again cause the Chinese to have even more doubts about American goodwill. And of course, ultimately, that's no doubt going to strengthen China's relationship with Russia going forward. So there we are, a military situation in eastern Ukraine, which, as I said, beginning to develop some clarity. Situation of the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol and in and around Severodonetsk looks extremely bad. And in addition, indications of unhappiness or possible unhappiness on the part of the Ukrainian leadership as shown by its reshuffle of generals. Again, this is my assessment. Others are free to take a different view. I am not, as I said, in a position to verify or corroborate this directly. I can only rely on the sources that I am provided with. And secondly, a complex meeting between the Americans and the Chinese in Rome, a meeting which lasted for 7 hours. The Americans say it was an intense discussion, which suggests that the Americans tried incredibly hard to get the Chinese to shift their position, only for the Chinese to evade the trap, to stand firm, and to brush the Americans off, as anybody familiar with China and the Chinese style of diplomacy would know that they would do. So there we are. I am going to reiterate the view that I've expressed in other places, that the situation the next few weeks, I suspect the next week or so, will be crucial both in terms of the military developments and the larger diplomatic developments also. And one way or the other, I will endeavour to the best of my abilities to keep you informed, at least of my views and analysis, though I cannot, as I said, in terms of the facts on the ground, give an absolute cast iron guarantee that all the facts are fully known and clear to me. Thank you very much for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs, both on this channel on our main channel, the Duran. And you can also, as I've said before, find us on Rumble and Locals, and you can also find us on a multiplicity of other platforms too. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the things you will find there. And also, if you want to show support for our work, well, you can check your subscription to this channel, and you can also tick the like button to this video. That's enough from me today. More from me soon.